Hello and welcome to Cruise Altitude, a light-hearted look at the world of aviation from the other side of the cockpit door. I'm Si.
And I'm John.
Coming up this week, we talk HEPA filters. We dip into the mailbag for the first time, and we talk about, well, what this is all about and why we're starting this podcast. So I guess we should start with a little bit of an introduction to us, John. So I'm Si, and I've been flying for just over 10 years as a commercial airline pilot, flying mostly short haul in and around Europe. How about you, John?
Similar to you, I've been working in aviation for about 12 years, spent a couple of years working for a flight training organisation, and then about 6 years flying short haul routes all over Europe, and the last 4 years flying large aircraft, long haul, all around the world.
So John, I was a little bit bored the other day and I've had a lot of time on my hands recently, and you know I like a stat and I like a tangent, so I was trying to work out how many days I've spent in the air based on my flying hours. So have a guess.
I've absolutely no idea. I'm going to go for continuously?
No, I've landed once or twice over this period.
Well, I'm going to go for 150 days.
312 days I've spent airborne, which is, getting
Wow.
on for a year, isn't it, soon? So
That's a lot
we can
of
have
time.
a little podcast anniversary party when hit the year mark, and I'll presume you know exactly how many days you've spent airborne.
I haven't got a clue. You've clearly got far much more time on your hands than I
I
have.
doubt it. I also worked out how many countries I've been to. Want to hazard a guess?
Right, so I'm going to go. Let me think. How many countries are there in Europe? I've got to put some thought into this one. I think I would say I'm going to go for 35.
Pretty close, 40. Although that was me looking at
not
a
bad.
map and sticking pins in it, so I'm not sure it was totally accurate. Anyway, so I thought, how can I put this into some kind of context? So here's a question for you. Do you know what the current record is for a NASA astronaut for the total amount of days in space, which is much cooler, by the way?
Oh, that's a tricky one as well. Well, space station, I'm thinking they spend quite a long time up there, don't they? Give me a clue.
Well, it's a little more than my 300.
I'm going to go
Actually, that's
400.
a bad clue. It's actually a lot more than my 300.
I'm going to say 510.
It's not a bad guess. 665 days.
Wow, that's a long
Yeah.
time.
Peggy Whitson, well done to her. That's
Is that
that's pretty impressive, and that puts my 312 days into just not worth talking about anymore, is it really?
So is that continuous time in
No,
space?
that's total days. She came home a few times, I believe, in those days.
She clearly didn't enjoy spending time with her husband then.
Perhaps. Okay, so why are we here and why are we starting this podcast? Well, at the risk of sounding like a Norwegian football commentator, aviation has taken one hell of a beating over recent months. So we thought it was time to inject a bit of life and put a smile back on some people's faces when they talk about aviation, dispel some of the myths, check some facts, and create some much needed positivity around aviation. It's given a lot to you and I over the years, John, and we felt it was time to give something back.
Which Norwegian commentator?
Good question. I'm not really sure it's the commentator that was the memorable part of the quote, but maybe if we ask Margaret Thatcher, she'll be able to fill you in. So, John, been flying recently?
Yeah.
Notice anything different?
Well, I guess obviously the impact that COVID's had has been a huge thing. It's changed lots of things about the way we travel around, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty impossible to ignore. And it has to be said that our industry has been particularly harshly affected by the coronavirus pandemic. It's pretty different, isn't it? I found it all very clean, no crowds, sanitizer everywhere. To be honest, it was great. And I think it's fair to say that there are lots of misgivings and misconceptions surrounding coronavirus and flying. And perhaps we could summarize it by saying that maybe it's not how we get somewhere, but where we end up that's the issue. After all, flying is one of the safest things you can do. And that's still true even during COVID times. In fact, John, I've got a stat for you. Ready for this?
Go on.
So, on average, a passenger would need to fly every X amount of years to be in with a chance of crashing, according to IATA. I'll give you 3 options so you can guess.
Well, it's not something you want to do, is it? So
No.
I'm hoping it's going to be a very, very long time.
Here we go then. So, is it A, 116 years, B, 174 years, or C, 241 years?
Oh, I'm going to go for...
And this is consecutive flying, so you can't land and land on a beach and then go back.
I'm going to go for C.
241 years.
241 years, yeah.
Correct. That's quite a long time.
Yeah.
I thought that was quite astonishing, and probably just proves how safe flying actually is. And by way of comparison, here's some other stats for you. So, again, I'll give you a choice of A, B, and C. But on average, per year, how many people do you think are killed by lightning strikes?
It's a very morbid load of statistics you've got here, but I'm going to go for...
Is it A, 24,000, A, 24,000, B, 30,000, or C, 40,000?
40. Hit by so direct lightning strike whilst
lightning strikes.
Walking down the pavement with a dog or going getting a paper or... Wow. And this is globally.
Yeah.
Oh, 24,000?
24,000. Good guess. Very good. So, by way of context, 24,000 people a year are killed by lightning strikes. However, you'd have to fly on a plane for 241 years consecutively to just be with a chance of crashing.
This sort of reminds me of that little section in, was it Come Fly With Me? Where he's telling the nervous flyer how many people have died.
All right, nervous flyer. Do you like champagne, John?
Well, I do, yeah. Yeah.
All right, then. So, on average, per year, how many people do you think are subjected to death by popping champagne corks? Would you ready for your options?
Go on.
Is it A, 14, B, 24, or C, 34?
Oh, they drink a lot of champagne in France, don't they?
They do.
And California as well. Give a good champagne from California, actually. Really good champagne. I'm going to go for the middle one, 24.
24. Correct.
God, 3 out of 3.
3 out of 3. Okay, last one for you. And, it's fair, you may have ended up on some kind of a desert island, or maybe not a desert island because there'd be no airport, but you've ended up on some tropical island and you're lying on the beach and you look up and you see a tree with coconuts and you think, I wonder how many people per year die from falling coconuts.
Definitely not what I would be thinking if I was sat on a tree underneath a coconut, on a beach underneath a coconut tree. But
I mean, is it A, 75, B, 100, or C, 150?
I'm gonna go middle ground again. I'm gonna go 100.
150.
Whoa, that's a lot of coconuts.
That is a lot. It's not a lot of coconuts, is it? But it's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people dying, yeah. I gotta think about it differently next time I'm on a beach underneath a coconut tree now.
Exactly. And you see the plane fly over and you think, safe to be on that plane for 241 years potentially under this tree.
Wow.
So, as we've just so eloquently proved, flying isn't really dangerous, and actually COVID hasn't really increased the risk necessarily of flying. And one of the main reasons for that is some of the clever technology that's found in aircraft. I've heard a lot, John, and I'll be honest, I hadn't heard much before, about HEPA filters, or HEPA filters, as someone described them to me as once. What is a HEPA filter?
Okay, yeah, so a HEPA filter, what it stands for first is it's a high efficiency particulate air filter. So it sounds all very complicated, but essentially what it is, it's a bunch of close-knit fibres, lots of different layers, and they trap impurities in the air. So the air's pushed through these little filters, full of dust, microbes, all sorts of different things. All those little bits get trapped in the close-knit fibres and then pushed out the other side, and what comes out essentially is clean virus-free air. Wow,
so they're pretty efficient.
Yeah, exactly, and they're used all over the place. So we sort of commonly talk about them in operating theatres, for example, in hospitals, so where you need really, really clean air. But also on aeroplanes. So since about the early 1980s, I would say pretty much every commercial aeroplane that's been flying will be fitted with HEPA filters. So if you go flying today, 100% chance, if you're on a modern commercial airliner, that there'll be a HEPA filter working all its magic behind the scenes, making sure the air that you breathe is as clean as it can be.
All right. So they're found in lots of fancy places like aerospace and nuclear power and pharmaceuticals and factories that make computer chips. But I've heard they're also found a lot closer to home sometimes.
Yeah. So even like really high-end vacuum cleaner or an air filtration unit you might have at home. So some of the high-end ones, they also will have HEPA filters. So they're a really handy little bit of kit and quite widely used.
Wow, okay. So most people have got a HEPA filter in the cupboard under the stairs.
Well, possibly, yeah, if they've got a really fancy vacuum cleaner, yeah. Yeah.
So how do they work on an aeroplane exactly?
Okay, so one of the things that people talk about, we hear quite a lot, is that the air that you breathe on aeroplanes, it's recirculated, so it's dirty. It's not really how it works. So sort of to break it down for you, essentially what happens is air is sucked in from outside. So during the flight, we use air that's coming in from outside, so ambient air. That comes into the cabin. It comes in through the air vents that are just above your head. And then that air is then what is pushed through the cabin. It's what you breathe. And it's sucked out the bottom of the cabin, just where your feet are, by some other vents. And then that air then goes back through the system, through a HEPA filter, which removes any little viruses or any other impurities that there might be in the air. And then on top of that, another 50% of air is sucked in, and that's mixed together. So you're constantly refreshing the air. So in fact, actually, the air in aeroplanes recirculate around about 20 to 30 times an hour. So what essentially that means is the air that you're breathing is pretty clean air, and probably a lot cleaner than you would find on a train or when you're sat in the cinema, for example. So
we're essentially getting fresh air coming into the cabin every couple of minutes on average.
Yeah, exactly. Once every couple of minutes. So yeah, 20 to 30 times an hour, it's refreshed. So 50% of the air is brought in from outside, 50% of the air is recirculated, and that just keeps getting cleaned and mixed up. So yeah, exactly. So
if I'm sitting in row Y, how many people would be breathing the same air as me?
Well, it's a bit complicated, but essentially the way the system works, it's top to bottom. So if you're a sort of standard economy cabin is probably the easiest way to explain it. So if you're sat in your row, the air comes in above your head.
Row one is my row, John.
Yeah, whichever row you sat in. So the air comes in above your head and it leaves the cabin down by your feet. So what that means is your little section of the aeroplane is getting its own air. So you're not necessarily breathing the same air as the person sat in the seat in front of you or the sat in the seat behind you.
So the air doesn't circulate from the front to the back of the cabin at all. So when I'm sitting in row 1 and you're sitting in row 26, as you normally would be, there's very little chance that you're going to be able to catch my microbes, or the other way around.
Yeah, exactly that. So the HEPA filter is used as part of that filtration system just to clean up all the air. So to give you an idea of how effective they are, so they're sort of certified for removing particle sizes from, I believe it's 0.003 microns up to about 10 microns, which means absolutely nothing to me. So a little bit of delving into what that actually is. So essentially COVID-19 is the virus that everyone's talking about at the moment. It's typically 0.1 microns in size. So it's well within the range of these HEPA filters. And they actually are saying that they will filter about 99.97% of COVID-19 out from the air. So making it pretty efficient.
And these HEPA filters, are they standard fit on aircraft, or have airlines had to retrofit them?
No. So these have been all fitted by the main manufacturers have been fitting these on airliners since the early 1980s. So chances are any aeroplane that you fly on now will definitely be fitted with HEPA filters. Another thing to mention as well is in terms of the air supply that you're getting per minute per person, it's about 15 to 20 cubic feet of air supply per person per minute in economy. So the total air supply is essentially sterile and it's free of any viruses.
Pretty impressive. And these HEPA filters presumably are cleaned on a regular basis to make sure that they perform to the levels and efficiency that they're designed to.
Yeah, so it varies aircraft to aircraft. So most airlines will replace them at regular intervals. So when they're doing a big service on the aeroplane to fit in with the routine sort of scheduled maintenance, there'll be minimum intervals and they'll stick to those. But actually, even if they're not cleaned, it might reduce the efficiency of the airflow coming through, but the efficiency of the actual filter at capturing the viruses is not affected at all. So you could fit one of these in an aeroplane in 1982 and not touch it, and it should technically still remove the same amount of virus from the air.
So when I go on my holiday, the air that I breathe on the aircraft is about as clean and safe as I'm going to get on that whole trip. And when I'm sitting in a bar having my pizza, there's a good chance that air is nowhere near as clean and pretty unfiltered. And similarly in my hotel room or on the train from the airport.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people talk about, I always catch a cold when I go on an aeroplane. Well, actually, that's nothing to do with the air supply. It's probably more likely that they've just been, touching dirty surfaces. And so that's why I guess, as we're all getting a bit accustomed to now, it's really important wiping everywhere down with sterile wipes. And lots of airlines are doing a lot more of that in between flights to make sure that it's a really COVID-safe environment. But absolutely, an aeroplane right now is probably one of the safest places you can be in terms of COVID transmission.
Cool. So wash your hands, get on the plane.
Yeah, it's hands, face, space, isn't it? That's the line at the moment. Okay, so it's time to dip into our mailbag then for the first time. So it's going to be a regular segment where we try and answer some of the questions that you have surrounding flying, aeroplanes, destinations, anything you want to ask us. So you can submit your questions via our website. You find all the links on there. It's cruisealtitude.com, or send us an email. It's at cruisealtitude@outlook.com, or via our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram pages. But Si, so what have we got this week? We've had quite a few questions sent in already, haven't we? So what have we got?
We have. We've had tons of questions sent in, and thanks very much for everybody who's already sent us a question. We'll try to get through as many as we can. The first question this week comes from David in Brackley, and he asks John, how much of a average flight is done by use of the autopilot? So I guess what he's really asking is how much do we actually fly and how much do we sit there and watch?
Hi David, thanks for the question. Well, it's an interesting one actually. It's one of those sort of, again, common misconceptions. People seem to think airplanes fly themselves these days, but if only they did, it would make our job quite a lot easier. So it varies, doesn't it? I mean, what would you tend to do, Si? One for or for flying the airplane?
I guess from a technical point of view, my aircraft type is able to be flown from a matter of seconds after takeoff all the way to landing. So in theory, the actual pilot hand flying is very little, but practically speaking, normally I would say the aircraft would be flown by the flight crew for probably the first 1 or 2 minutes of the departure, and then for the last 3 or 4 minutes until landing. And most of the rest of the flight will be handled through the autopilot, which still would require selections from the flight crew to manipulate the autopilot to perform the functions they require it to, but not physically hand flying as such.
Yeah, I think that's one of the sort of commonly misunderstood things, isn't it? So the autopilot itself, it's not a case of just switching it on and leaving it to do its thing. What it will do is it'll keep the aircraft straight and level. It'll turn it in the right direction. It'll turn it onto a heading or towards a different point in space that we might want to fly to at that time. But it does require the pilots to program it. So all through the flight, we're always intervening. We're always actioning things through the autopilot. So essentially, the aeroplane's never really flying itself. If the pilot wasn't there, then the aeroplane probably wouldn't get to its destination, I think is the key thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And also, I think it's fair to say that the autopilot is a tool that we can use to make our lives easier, but also make the whole operation safer. So I would say all commercial operators would certainly encourage maximum use of the autopilot, and certainly use the autopilot at appropriate points during the flight. And the main reason for that is not that the autopilot can do necessarily a better job, although in my case it almost certainly can, but it frees up capacity for the flight crew to be able to actually monitor the performance of the aircraft. Whereas what's often the case is when one of the flight crew is actually manually flying the aircraft, the other pilot is fully engaged in monitoring what that pilot is doing, and that can detract their attention and capacity away from secondary tasks, which is potentially a less safe operation than if both flight crew are engaged in monitoring the autopilot.
Yeah, exactly. So to sort of directly answer your question, David, then normally in a flight, the pilot would do the takeoff, maybe fly the airplane up to about 10,000 feet, something like that, and then just to make task sharing a little bit easier and increase sort of safety of the operation, building that extra little bit of buffer that everybody wants when they're going on the holidays. We'd put the autopilot in around then, and similarly on the way into destination. So just before landing, we'll disconnect the autopilot, fly the airplane for the last few minutes, and probably about 95%, 99% maybe, something like that of landings that you'll have done as a passenger in an airplane will have been done by the pilot. It's only really in sort of very foggy weather that the autopilot would be left to land the airplane. Yeah,
that's true. And at the moment, I don't believe there are many aircraft, if any aircraft out there that can do an automatic takeoff, but certainly most commercial aircraft can do automatic landings, although most pilots would elect to do a manual landing on a day where the weather was good enough for many complicated reasons.
So you like a stat. What was the first commercial airliner that could land itself? What was the first auto land system fitted to?
Ooh, well, the answer to these questions normally is Trident.
Yeah, very good. One for the. I think that was potluck there, wasn't it?
If in doubt, say Trident in aviation. They'll get you a long way.
One for the British Patriots, the good old Hawker Siddeley Trident, British
certainly
engineering.
Is. But great question, David. Thanks very much. Our second question today comes from DJ in Liverpool. Thanks, DJ, for your question. He asks, John, which are the hardest places to land and why?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I suppose that's subjective, isn't it? It depends where you've flown to.
Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, there's quite a few airports that are notoriously a little bit tricky. So I'm thinking sort of top of my head, I would say Madeira comes to mind. So Funchal on the island of Madeira. Gibraltar is another one that's quite commonly known to be tricky. But what was your?
Yeah, I think there's different reasons that an airport could be considered hard to land at. It might be because the runway is really short. So somewhere like Leeds Bradford or Jersey, for example. It might be because the weather is notoriously dodgy, like Gibraltar or Madeira, as you mentioned, where you might be encountering strong winds and particularly strong crosswinds. Or it could be because the airspace is very congested and air traffic control is not its best. So somewhere with high congestion like Heathrow requires quite a lot of concentration from a physical air traffic control point of view, even though it's two massive runways. So from an actual landing point of view, it's not that difficult. Whereas Jersey, where it's you, one man and his dog, that is more difficult because the runway is quite short and you need to make sure you touch down in the right place. So I guess it depends on different factors as to what makes a place more difficult than another.
I suppose the traditional one everyone thinks of is I've seen all those videos on YouTube. It's Kai Tak, the old airport in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Was very, very notorious. Worth checking out on YouTube if you've not seen those already. But it's a fascinating little approach into there. Something that quite a few people got wrong over the years. But fortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. It's a ferry cruise terminal now. Apparently,
that's true. So, probably a dawdling Trident, though, wasn't it?
If you could get one all the way from Europe to Hong Kong, you're doing well. The new airport in Hong Kong is still quite a tricky place to fly. You get all sorts of different weird wind effects going around from the mountains, so that can make it quite entertaining on a day. But it's something I guess we're all trained to do, aren't we? So
yeah, absolutely. And it also depends on other factors. So there are some airports that are really well designed airports with great big long runways, and they're not too busy, and air traffic control are brilliant. But then the local authorities may have put restrictions on the actual flight path you can take to get into an airport due to things like noise abatement, which is to do with making sure that you don't overfly densely populated areas too low down and create loads of noise. And often what that can do is mean that you're not able to line up with the runway until quite late on in the approach, which can be quite a challenge. And going back to our previous question, would probably mean the flight crew need to take manual control of the aircraft at an earlier point in the flight than they normally would. So those can be challenging places too.
Yeah. So, God, where's your personal, or where would you say is the hardest place you've landed?
I would say one of the places that I used to really dislike going to was Nantes.
I just like going to Nantes
because the runway in Nantes is probably one of the lumpiest runways I've ever landed on, to the point where when you are about to touch down, you can't see the other end of the runway. It's kind of like Manchester, but amplified. So that gives a really weird visual perspective, and pretty hard to produce a landing that you don't have to apologise for later on.
Yeah, I would say for me it's probably Madeira, although 9 times out of 10 Madeira is absolutely fine, but you can get some pretty interesting winds there, so always makes it a fun day out.
That's true. But yeah, great question, DJ. And next time I'm flying somewhere challenging, I'll think of that question and report back. Our final question this week comes from Laura from Telford. Thanks again for your question, Laura. She says, how do you taxi a plane on the ground? That's a good question.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on the type of airplane. So when we all start flying in the sort of little Cessnas and Piper Warriors, that type of thing, you tend to do it using your feet. So right foot goes right, left foot goes left. That sounds about right? The pedals the rudder pedals will actually be attached to the nose wheel of the airplane as well. But on modern jets, it's a bit more complicated, isn't it? So yeah. Usually you'll have what they call a tiller. So it's a little mini wheel or handle next to the pilot, and you use that to steer you around on the ground, basically.
Yeah, it's quite primitive, isn't it, really? It's, like you say, a little tiller, and like you'd find on a boat, I suppose. And,
yeah, exactly that.
You literally just turn it with your hand. And yeah, it gives you some directional control, particularly at low speed. And then if you need to manoeuvre at high speed, or we need to make a really tight turn, then we might use the engines to give us a little bit more ability to turn. So if we're on a stand where we need to make a sharp turn off, then we'd use that tiller initially, but then we spool up either left or the right engine depending on which way we want to turn to give us that little bit more thrust to give us that tighter turning circle.
Yeah, and then once you get onto the runway in a modern jet, the tiller becomes a little bit useless, really.
Yeah.
So then we go back to basics, really, and we use our feet to keep the airplane straight on the centre line, so that we can take off from the middle of the runway, essentially. So it's just keeping it straight with your feet.
That's right. And some aircraft have only have a tiller on the captain's side. Some aircraft have it on both sides. So some operators might mandate that only a captain could taxi the aircraft on the ground, whereas other operators will allow either of the pilots to taxi.
Yeah, good question, Laura.
Yeah, great, Laura. Thanks very much for all your questions. We really appreciate you getting in touch. We'll be back with some more answers to those questions in our next episode. I think, John, that's all we've got time for this week. It's been interesting. It's been fun. Yeah,
I hope you enjoyed it. And as Si says, don't forget to get in touch via various social media platforms. Links can be found at cruisealtitude.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe via your favourite podcast provider to make sure you don't miss an episode.
Thanks for listening to Cruise Altitude. Don't forget to subscribe via your favourite podcast provider, leave us a review and get in touch via Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. Links can be found over on our website, cruisealtitude.com. A down-to-earth podcast from Cruise Altitude.
I'm off to watch Challenger.
Good for you. I'm off to watch Air Crash Investigation. In fact, I'm not. I'm off to watch Garden Rescue.
Right.